Thank you, Richard, and can I also welcome everyone to our conference today. I very much hope that you enjoy it. As Richard said, my presentation is entitled A Year of Challenges and Opportunities, but before I start, I wanted to reflect on the very sad news that Alistair Mitchell passed away in February. Alistair was part of the aquaculture and recreational fisheries team at Marine Scotland for most of the time that I've been involved in fisheries management. We work closely on a range of policy areas. I think it's fair to say, and I think Alistair would agree, that we didn't agree on everything. But Alistair was always willing to listen, and I really will miss our conversations, which often took place away from the office over a good cup of coffee. Our thoughts are very much with Alistair's family, friends and colleagues at this time. So I just wanted to highlight to you that our annual review was published earlier on today, and hopefully you've all received a link to that document, which is published on our website. I'm going to be talking a little bit today about some of the activities that Fisheries Management Scotland and indeed our members are involved in, but there's much more detail in our annual review, and it also has a sort of draft catch statistics for a range of rivers across Scotland. So please take a look. I think it's a really good publication and well worth your time to look at it. So in terms of challenges and opportunities, I think probably the biggest challenge that everyone in this audience and indeed worldwide has been facing over the last year has been Covid-19. And we've put a lot of work into addressing that issue over the last little while. So as you'll be aware, when the first lockdown took place in March 2020, angling ceased at that point. There was really no angling of any note taking place in Scotland during March and April. Now, as a representative body for the District Salmon Fishery Boards and the Fisheries Trust, we therefore acted swiftly to provide guidance to our members across a whole range of issues in terms of the health and safety of employees, in terms of whether angling was appropriate during that time. We also worked with Marine Scotland to ensure that we had appropriate guidance for those members of staff who continued to operate during the lockdown, and in particular enforcement staff and some key elements of field work. And we also provided guidance on the limited financial support that was available at that time. And finally, we were looking at the legal requirements that District Salmon Fishery Boards in particular had to meet in relation to the salmon legislation, some of which were quite challenging to meet because of the lockdown and the inability to meet in public. Although there was a limited resumption of angling in May, that didn't really solve the issues that many people within our community were facing, because the travel restrictions that were ongoing meant that anglers weren't travelling to Scotland from other parts of the UK or indeed from abroad. So there was still a really big financial hit for our sector. On top of that, even if we hadn't had a lockdown in 2021, we still would have expected a really big financial hit this year as well, because in many cases, bookings which were cancelled in 2020 were carried over into 2021, and therefore that financial impact was carried over as well. And then what we did right the way through that process was make the case to Scottish Government for financial support for the sector. But can I just remind everyone to go on to mute? Thank you. Most of the funding that was available, most of the financial support that was available didn't apply to the fisheries management sector or indeed to salmon fisheries across Scotland. And they're a really important part of the rural economy, and I'll come on to that a little bit more in a minute. So I wanted just to talk a little bit about the relationship between angling and fisheries management in Scotland, because I don't think this is well understood, and I think it's useful just to spend a little bit of time to demonstrate some of the challenges that we faced in relation to this. So the District Salmon Fishery Boards across Scotland, the statutory managers of salmon and sea trout fisheries, are funded through the Fisheries Assessment. And the Fisheries Assessment is essentially a local tax which all salmon fishery owners have to pay to the District Salmon Fishery Board. Now, the Fisheries Assessment, although it's set out through the salmon legislation, is essentially a form of non-domestic rate. All salmon fisheries within District Salmon Fishery Board areas are assessed by the district assessors employed by the local authorities and given a rateable value in exactly the same way as would be the case for business rates or non-domestic rates. And that value is based largely on catch. So there's quite fundamental issues there in basing the main funding mechanism for fisheries management on what is a declining resource. Unlike business rates and non-domestic rates, however, the rate in the pound is not fixed for the fisheries assessment. It is set by the district salmon fishery boards. And that's really important because it means that the fisheries assessment raises approximately £4.5 million across Scotland in an average year. If salmon fisheries paid non-domestic rates or business rates, it would raise about £600,000. So fishery owners are paying an awful lot more than they would be paying under a non-domestic rate situation. It's also really important in terms of how we fund fisheries management and how that financial support in terms of COVID didn't come across to our sector, because although the fisheries assessment is a form of non-domestic rate, it was not considered to be so under most of the COVID support mechanisms. So most of those mechanisms didn't work for our members, primarily because they're based on business rates or non-domestic rates. In addition, the fisheries trusts within our sector are all independent charities, and they really struggled to get COVID support as well. There were some specific funding mechanisms available, such as the Third Sector Resilience Fund, but many of our members didn't qualify for that fund, and it was hugely oversubscribed anyway. And just to top the whole thing off, there was no specific funding support developed for the fisheries management community in Scotland. Many other sectors of the economy did receive that sort of funding, but the fisheries management community did not. So we continue to press the case to Scottish ministers and for funding support. So despite all of those challenges, fisheries management activity continued in Scotland. I just want to reflect on that a little bit. I mentioned earlier on that we produced guidance in relation to bailiffing that made sure that we had bailiffs available on our riverbanks to protect our fish and fisheries. And working in close partnership with Police Scotland, they were able to detect a really significant spike in poaching that occurred during the lockdown. So it was really important that our bailiffs were there to protect our fish and fisheries, and there was nearly a 282% increase in poaching during that period. We also had to reassess the way in which we worked, like so many others did. So we engaged with our members through members' meetings and a whole series of other routes online. And we also developed very quickly training courses that we delivered online as well, both for bailiffing and also in relation to a whole series of other activities, such as those delivered through the Scottish Fisheries Coordination Centre. So electrofishing training, scale reading training, and we're developing other things going forward. But despite all those challenges, and despite the fact that a reasonable proportion of our staff were on furlough during the lockdown, we still managed to do some really quite extensive work, and I'm very proud that our members did this. So we managed to plant over 100,000 trees on riverbanks to help shade rivers from and to keep them cool in the light of climate change. Our members improved over 2,000 kilometres of river habitat and worked with 53 schools, obviously online, and engaged over 4,000 children in education projects. And also, our members submitted 343 responses to proposed developments across Scotland, all with a view to protecting our fish and fisheries and to improve the habitat and the situation for those fish. So I've spoken about the challenges, but there are still some opportunities going forward as well. And one of the things that we've been working on over the last little while with Marine Scotland is the wild salmon strategy. And it's really good to note that the wild salmon crisis that we've been talking about for some time now is now widely recognised. And the wild salmon strategy came about from a programme for government commitment from the Scottish Government. And it also recognises that we essentially need to do more across all 12 of the pressure groups that have been identified by Marine Scotland in partnership with our members. We've been calling for several years now to make for government and agencies to make wild salmon conservation a national priority, and we very much hope that the wild salmon strategy will be the route through which we achieve that. Now, the second session today is going to explore some of the pressures that we're looking at in the wild salmon strategy, or will be looked at in the wild salmon strategy in more detail. So I hope you get the opportunity to stay for the whole day and catch up on some of those presentations as well. One of the key elements of the work that we're doing in relation to the wild salmon strategy is a project that we're running in partnership with Marine Scotland and with our membership to map salmon pressures across Scotland so that we have a sense of the severity and spatial extent of these pressures that salmon face. And we hope that that will enable coordinated national management action which will help support the extensive work that's taking place at a local level to manage these pressures. It will also help to quantify a range of pressures which are not covered by other routes, such as our river basin management plans in Scotland. For example, predation and illegal fishing, for which there's lots of information out there, but it's not really captured on a national basis at the moment. And by capturing these wider pressures, we really hope that we can help to harmonise local and national drivers that are affecting salmon. And so when people are looking at the licensing decisions, for example, by SEPA, they're taking into account these wider effects. So if you're making a regulatory decision and making that regulatory decision potentially exacerbates issues of predation or illegal fishing, hopefully that can be captured going forward. So just in terms of SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, this is a really important year as well. And a year we'll be working very closely with SEPA when we get the opportunity to do so. Obviously, there are issues at the moment in relation to the cyber attack, and there were quite significant issues last year in terms of SEPA's approach to COVID-19. But hopefully those things will ease over the next few months. SEPA play a really key role in protecting and enhancing our aquatic environment. Their regulatory remit covers a whole host of pressures that salmon and other freshwater fish and fisheries face. So we work really closely with SEPA, both at a local level and supporting our members to address particular issues, but also at a national level through the Fish and Fisheries Advisory Group. And we're working on mechanisms at the moment with SEPA to address, for example, fish passage at large impoundments, diffuse and point source pollution, and issues relating to water scarcity. But this is also a big year because this is the year in which SEPA are consulting on the third and final River Basin Management Plan. And that is the plan by which SEPA will use to protect and to enhance the water environment and try to ensure that all rivers are at good ecological status by 2027. There's also a further consultation running this year which relates to another key issue for our fish and fisheries, and that is water scarcity. Back in 2018, we had a really difficult situation where not only were water levels extremely low, but water temperature also increased quite markedly, and you'll hear more about that later on today. But I think it's fair to say that there's a pretty strong view within the fisheries management sector that we need our regulators to regulate, and a change in approach is required. If we're going to address the wild salmon crisis, and indeed the wider biodiversity crisis, just to coin a phrase that's been used quite a lot over the last little while, the status quo is really not an option. And finally, I just want to reflect on the Missing Salmon Alliance, and again our third session today is looking at the Missing Salmon Alliance in more detail, but I just wanted to reflect on this because I think this is a really massive opportunity for us to work together in a more coordinated manner to make the situation better for wild salmon. So Fisheries Management Scotland and the Rivers Trust joined the Missing Salmon Alliance in January and joined the Atlantic Salmon Trust, the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust and the Angling Trust in working together to make the situation better. And we think that that coordinated approach of working together is really, really important if we're going to make a big difference for salmon. It also, from a Fisheries Management Scotland perspective, gives us the potential to better support the really important work that our members are doing at a local level, also to make the situation better. And there's a number of important projects being progressed, which you'll hear more about in the final session. So just to conclude, we find ourselves at a really crucial crossroads at the moment. The climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis need urgent action, and human impacts on land and at sea mean that our wild salmon are in real trouble. By working together, we've got the opportunity to put things right, and throughout today we'll be exploring those opportunities and the changes that need to happen to facilitate them. So I very much hope you enjoy our conference, but I also hope that by the end of the day, you'll have a clear understanding of what you can do to help. Thank you very much indeed.